Apple was forced to update to USB-C. Everyone knows that. I'm happy about it. But there's something people keep saying that's just historically wrong. So jump back to 2011. The current state of USB is in disarray. Mini USB is on the way out. Micro USB is the most popular connector. If you ever used a PlayStation 3, you remember this one. PlayStation 4 used the micro USB for controllers. And the iPhone at the time was still using the 30-pin connector left over from the iPod. Now I'm showing this connector because this cable connects from FireWire to 30-pin because the 30-pin was magical. The 30-pin literally had pins for so many different things. It had like line in, line out for audio, it had composite video, it had S-video, but it also had separate pins for FireWire power versus USB. There were just separate pins for everything. This made it really easy for Apple to build like passive adapters, things where you could just plug it in and audio works. You don't need a DAC inside of a converter cable to convert back to audio. You don't need a video encoder in the cable to encode video. The iPod or iPhone would just stream it all out. As time went on though, no one cared about FireWire anymore, so these pins just were useless. It also just got cheaper to put a DAC inside of a cable or a video encoder inside of the cable, so you don't really need all of this anymore. But Apple looked at these two implementations of USB and were like, these kind of suck for mobile phones. These are really popular in the Android world, but they're not really the greatest usability because one, they're not reversible. You don't know which side's up, common problem with USB, but also like they're flimsy. So in 2012, Apple introduced the new Lightning cable. It was an all-digital cable. All the pins could be reassigned, but it uses all digital I/O, no more analog over this pinouts or anything like that. You could reassign the pins for any kind of use case, and it was reversible. So Apple was in development of the Lightning connector from 2010 to 2012 when they finally released it to everyone. And at the exact same time that they implemented it, some people from the USB Implementers Forum announced that they are going to start work on USB-C. Now, initially, Apple wasn't involved with that standard. It was Intel and Texas Instruments had published a paper initially, got some comments from some other companies, but they were facing the same problems Apple was trying to solve, and they wanted to make a connector that solved the same problems. And even the initial one actually wasn't like rotational symmetry. You couldn't reverse it from their first implementation. They learned that from Apple's connector. Like, wait, that's a great idea. They were trying to solve the case that you have a cable with two ends on it that are different. Now, back when USB was invented, it had this top-down topology where you would basically have a host controller, typically a computer, something that you plug USB devices into. That would connect to devices directly or connect to a hub, which then would connect to devices, and you could have these layers. The problem is, later down the road, it became apparent that you sometimes want a device also to be a host, but you don't want to have multiple ports on it. You don't want to have to put a B receptacle and an A receptacle on a device so that it can be both a host and a client. So they invented this weird standard called USB OTG, or on the go, which allows you to use this like weird pinout system to turn it into a host. It's terrible. USB-C solved that. You could have one port that's the same on both ends, and you can connect anything to anything. And then whatever you plug it into will negotiate. Am I the host? Are you the client? And we'll figure out the topology together. Now, while Apple did not invent USB-C initially, they did jump on to help with it, committing a lot of resources. And in fact, they're widely the reason why USB became popular in the first place. In fact, they shipped a MacBook with only USB-C, and people called it the dongle book because they got rid of all the other ports that people liked, because they wanted people to use dongle accessories because this new port would have solved everything. They helped accelerate this new standard. In fact, this isn't the first time Apple's done something similar. Back when we used FireWire, if you remember FireWire, it was this pre-USB standard. It was a little expensive, but Apple helped create the standard. They charged a lot of royalties for it, so it didn't take off, but it was the exact same thing. The same port on both sides. It was any kind of topology would work, and they actually made the very first iPod only have a FireWire port. There was no 30-pin connector. It wasn't until Apple decided they wanted to sell an iPod that actually worked with a PC that they decided to move to the 30-pin adapter, which had USB signaling so that Windows machines could copy to it. But if you had a Mac and you had a FireWire connector, it would copy files like 10 times faster, but that's a whole other video. Okay, fast forward to 2014, USB-C is finally standardized and is released on a bunch of devices. The first MacBooks start coming out with it. and it hadn't actually taken off at this point. There was one notable exception. The Nokia N1 had rushed to be the very first device to use USB-C on a device. And even then, it didn't even use USB 3.0, it used USB 2.0. They just swapped the connector from the micro that they were using at the time. Now, adding USB-C back in 2014 all the way up to even 2019 was still cost prohibitive. It was extremely expensive to put in a USB-C port in most hardware. And so even through like 2016, 2017, only the most flagship phones were just barely supporting USB-C. But Apple, shipping with the Lightning connector, had been shipping that connector for almost 5 years at that point. Now, it's also important to note that USB's standards have very little to do with USB ports. There are limitations on which ports can do which standards. In fact, when USB 3.0 came out and it allowed for much faster connections up to gigabits instead of 400 megabit that we had with USB 2.0, the first versions of the microport even had these like weird extensions to support USB 3.0 in order to get enough pins to transfer at the speeds necessary. USB-C fixes that by having lots more pins in that one little barrel connector. Now, the Lightning connector has a lot less pins than USB-C does, so it's really hard to do as a USB 3.0, but they were able to actually pull it off once in one iPad Pro where they could get USB 3.0, but they only used it with one dongle and only where the iPad was host, because when they try to reverse this, existing cables would break working with the PC because they don't know about USB 3.0 standard, so they don't know how to negotiate or pin out correctly for USB 3.0. So we never saw a USB 3.0 connector for Lightning from a host to the iPad. Most of this is kind of moot anyways, because the way Apple was trending was they wanted more people not to use physical connectors, but to use like AirDrop and Wi-Fi to transfer files, because it was a better experience for most of their users rather than like plugging them in. We're done with the days of like you plug into your iTunes to update your iPhone. Now you do everything over the air, and that's the way the world should work around a cloud service. Unfortunately, like if you're a pro and you're using your iPad or your iPhone to record video to edit, it is a terrible experience, so they needed to do something. So in 2020, we got the iPad Pro, which was the first iPad with USB-C, and this supported USB 3.0. But in order to do that, they shipped with a very specific one-off processor called the A12Z, which was the first time they deviated from shipping the same processors as what they do in their iPhones, because they needed a processor that had a USB 3.0 controller to support the faster speeds that USB-C does. It's also one of the first iPads that uses USB-C's alternative modes. So you know I was saying back when we had the 30-pin connector, we had separate pins for doing different types of signals? Well, one of the cool things in USB-C is that it has this thing called alternative mode, where after you connect, it can negotiate, and then it just completely switches to a different protocol from USB. And you can do things like DisplayPort. You remember like when we had physical DisplayPort cables? It also supports this mobile link standard, which isn't important, but it also supports things like HDMI and Thunderbolt. Remember like when we had the physical Thunderbolt connector? Ironically, that used a DisplayPort connector because DisplayPort had its own alternative mode. It's meta as hell. Now, one of the things I've been seeing people get mad at is that the iPhone base model, the 15, only supports USB 2 with USB-C, and that the new Pro supports USB 3 up to 10 gigabit with USB-C. And that's all because of the processor. So the base models usually run the same processor that the previous Pro generations ran from last year. Now, last year's Pro model didn't have USB 3.0 because there's no physical USB 3.0 controller on the CPU. So in order to add that, they would have to go make a new CPU, but they've made a ton of the A16s. They need time at the Taiwanese semiconductor company to make different chips, and so they reserve these and they make a ton of them, and any over or undersells that they don't sell go into the next model phone or into Apple TVs or other devices. And so they have a lot of these laying around. That's their model. So that's why this year's base model doesn't have a USB 3.0 controller. It never needed one. They just physically changed the port out, so it still signals over USB 2.0, whereas the Pro gets it because it has a brand new controller. Now, given this whole timeline, I do think Apple should have switched to USB-C on the iPhones around 2020, maybe 2021, not all the way to today. But I think it's unfair to say, well, Android's been using it for years, why didn't they switch? When they had an ecosystem already in place with people using this Lightning cable. This has been the case for almost 10 years. So I'd give them a little bit more credit. Without Apple, USB-C would be nothing.